So picture this, right? You're just sitting on your couch, and you're scrolling through your news feed on your phone.
Like we all do, yeah.
Exactly. And you swipe past a headline about, a brutal territorial war in Eastern Europe.
Right.
Then you swipe again, and it's this breakdown of some global climate summit where, like, 200 countries are fighting over carbon emissions.
Yeah, just massive structural disagreements.
And then you swipe a third time, and it's an alert about a huge multinational tech company dodging billions in taxes by shifting profits through 3 different countries.
It's exhausting just hearing about it.
It is. It feels totally chaotic, right? Like there's no underlying logic, just this terrifying lottery of global events happening all at once. I mean, it's completely overwhelming.
Or it is entirely overwhelming. And, the reason it feels that way is that we're essentially trying to read a completely foreign language without a dictionary.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We look at the world stage and we just see a bunch of random noise. But in reality, there is a very specific, deeply entrenched architecture dictating almost everything you just mentioned.
Which brings us to our mission for this deep dive. Today, we are handing you the ultimate decoder ring.
I love that framing.
Right, because we're working through this really comprehensive academic text on the foundations of international relations. And we aren't just going to skim the surface here.
No, we are really getting into the weeds.
We are going to dismantle the entire machine of global politics and show you the gears. We'll look at where the concept of a country even came from.
Because it wasn't always just there.
Exactly. And we'll see how scholars predict whether states will go to war or trade, and why massive borderless corporations and human rights activists are completely rewriting the rules of the game as we speak.
To really understand the machine, you have to look at the factory where the parts were made, right? If you want to comprehend why a modern border dispute happens, or why the United Nations operates the way it does, you have to realize that the primary actor on the global stage, the sovereign state, is an invention.
Right.
It's a piece of technology.
And it's not a natural phenomenon at all. A state isn't a mountain or a river, but we treat it like one, don't we?
We absolutely do. We take it completely for granted.
Like when you look at a globe, the colored patches for France or Brazil or Japan, they look permanent. But if we wind the clock back to Europe before the 1600s, those neat lines completely disappear.
They do. It was a very different world.
The text calls this the medieval system, but I honestly just think of it as the medieval mess.
The medieval mess. Honestly, that is an incredibly accurate description.
It really is, right?
Yeah. So imagine you are a farmer living in what we now call Germany in the 14th century. Your life is intensely local. You never leave your village.
You're just farming, paying taxes.
Exactly. You owe taxes and labor to a local feudal lord. But that lord answers to a higher duke, who maybe answers to a king. But wait, it doesn't stop there, right? Because layered right on top of that local hierarchy are these massive, overarching, universal authorities.
Right, the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah, and the church wasn't just a place you went on Sunday.
Oh, not at all. It was an immense political and economic power. It levied its own taxes, called tithes, right out of your harvest.
Right.
It had its own courts. It owned vast swaths of land. And alongside the church, you had the Holy Roman Emperor claiming this sort of divinely ordained secular authority.
Over hundreds of overlapping territories. Right?
Yes, hundreds of semi-independent principalities, free cities, and duchies.
So as that peasant, your loyalties are completely fractured. I mean, your local lord wants your labor, the emperor wants you for a military campaign, and the pope says he holds the keys to your eternal soul.
And demands your absolute obedience.
And you're like a massive, chaotic group chat where everyone is an admin.
That is a great way to put it. Right. Everyone keeps changing the server rules, deleting each other's messages, claiming they are the one true owner. There's no single authority you can point to and say, the buck stops there.
And that fractured system, it was inherently unstable. When it finally broke, it resulted in one of the most cataclysmic events in human history, the 30 Years' War.
Which ran from 1618 to 1648, right?
Exactly. And it's often taught as a religious war sparked by the Protestant Reformation, Catholics fighting Protestants.
But the text reveals a much darker structural reality to it.
It does. Religion was the spark, sure, but the fuel was this desperate, vicious scramble for hegemony. The medieval order was dying. The Pope's universal authority was crumbling.
And the monarchs of Europe just recognized an opportunity to consolidate power.
Yes, and the devastation was unimaginable. We throw around historical dates, but let's sit with the human cost of this for a second.
Yeah, please. Because the text points out that up to a third of the population of Germany was wiped out.
A third.
Just a third of the people, gone.
And armies didn't have modern supply chains back then. They were essentially heavily armed mobs of mercenaries roaming the countryside.
Just eating everything in sight.
Eating everything, burning farms, and bringing the plague wherever they went. It was a complete societal collapse.
It's just horrifying to think about.
It really is. And it was out of that profound trauma that the leaders of Europe finally reached their breaking point. In 1648, they convened and signed the Treaty of Westphalia.
And this is, like, arguably the most crucial pivot point in the foundation of international relations.
Absolutely. The Westphalian system introduced a radical new software update for global politics.
Which was sovereignty.
Sovereignty.
Which fundamentally changed that crypt chat we were talking about.
Yeah.
Instead of one chaotic room where the Pope, the Emperor, and the kings are all shouting over each other, Westphalia basically created separate, private Discord servers.
That's the perfect analogy.
If you are the king of France, France is your server. You have absolute exclusive control over the rules, the religion, and the people inside that server.
No one from the outside, not the Pope, not the Emperor, can ban your users or change your settings.
That mechanism of exclusive territorial control, that is the bedrock of our modern world.
It is. And because every state is sovereign, every state is formally equal in legal terms. But this introduces the most fundamental dilemma in international relations.
Right, because if every state is supreme within its own borders, and there is no overarching authority above
Then
them.
that means the international system is in a perpetual state of anarchy.
Now, anarchy is one of those words that immediately makes people picture rioters smashing windows.
Yeah, total chaos.
But IR scholars use it entirely differently, don't they? It doesn't mean chaos, it means literally without a ruler.
Right. Think about the difference between domestic life and international life. If your neighbor steals your car, you call the police.
Because there is a higher authority.
Exactly.
No.
An authority with a monopoly on violence that enforces the law. But if country A invades country B, there is no global 9/11.
There's no world police force with the authority to arrest a state.
No. It's a pure self-help system. You either have a big enough military to defend yourself, or you find some really strong friends to form an alliance with.
But wait, I'm stuck on a terminology issue here. The text, and scholars in general, they keep calling this the international system or the nation state.
Oh, right.
But in 1648, there were no nations. These were absolute monarchs treating territories like personal real estate.
Yeah.
The people living there didn't feel like a nation, right?
Ooh, that is a critical distinction to make. Westphalia gave us the state, the physical container.
Right.
It gave us the borders, the standing armies, the tax collectors, the bureaucratic machinery of control. But you're right, it did not give us the nation.
Because the early modern state was basically a coercive extraction machine. The king was the state. The people were merely subjects.
They were property.
They were property.
Precisely. The fusion of the nation with the state didn't happen for another century and a half. We really have to look to the end of the 18th century, specifically the American Revolution in 1776 and the French Revolution in 1789.
Let's focus on the French Revolution.
Yeah.
Because the psychological shift there is just staggering.
It's massive.
You go from a society where a peasant works the land for King Louis XVI to suddenly, we are the citizens of France.
Right.
The state is no longer the king's property. The state is the physical manifestation of the shared identity, culture, and soul of the French people.
It's the birth of the nation state.
And this wasn't just a philosophical shift either. It completely revolutionized warfare and power.
Oh, completely. Before this, monarchs fought wars using small armies of paid mercenaries.
Or unwilling subjects who would desert at the first opportunity.
Exactly. But once the French revolutionary government and later Napoleon instituted the levée en masse, the mass conscription of citizens, they were suddenly fielding armies of hundreds of thousands of men.
Because they were fighting for their patrie, their homeland.
Right. They were fueled by patriotism, not just a paycheck.
Yeah.
And that made them a terrifying juggernaut.
Napoleon just steamrolled over the old traditional kingdoms of Europe.
He did. And the text highlights how those older aristocratic states looked at France with absolute horror.
Not just because of the guillotine.
No, because they realized they were functionally obsolete. They had to adopt this new nation-state model. They had to cultivate a sense of national identity just to survive the military threat.
And throughout the 19th century, we see this play out. National communities began demanding their own states.
This mechanism drove the unification of Germany, the unification of Italy, and, the slow, agonizing collapse of the massive multi-ethnic empires.
Like the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. The map of Europe was completely redrawn around the idea that every distinct nation deserved its own sovereign state.
Yeah.
Okay, so I follow the logic of how Europe sorted itself out. But calling this the global international system feels like a massive historical sleight of hand.
How so?
Well, this wasn't a global consensus. It was a very specific European blueprint that got violently forced onto the rest of the planet.
It is the original sin of the international system. You're absolutely right. Europe didn't just invent the nation-state. They exported it at the barrel of a gun. Through ruthless imperialism and colonization, European powers subjugated the vast majority of the globe.
You had corporate state hybrids, like the Dutch East India Company, acting as sovereign entities.
Violent resource extraction in the Americas.
In the literal carving up of the African continent at the Berlin Conference of 1884, right? Where European diplomats drew arbitrary lines on maps, completely ignoring pre-existing ethnic, linguistic, or political realities on the ground.
They took the Westphalian software and aggressively installed it on hardware that wasn't designed for it.
That's such a good way to put it. And the tragedy, the really bitter irony here, is how this model became truly universal.
It is tragic. During the 20th century, when colonized peoples across Africa and Asia fought these brutal, exhausting wars for decolonization, they realized something terrible.
What was that?
The only way the international community, which was still run by their former colonizers, would recognize their hard-won independence was if they played by the European rules.
They had to adopt the exact aesthetic and bureaucratic structure of their oppressors.
To be taken seriously, to get a seat at the table, a newly independent society needed defined, rigid borders.
They needed a capital city, a foreign ministry, a standing army, a national anthem, a flag.
They had to set up a Discord server that looked exactly like the French or British servers.
Wow. And understanding this historical baggage changes everything. Like when we see a state in the global south struggling today with civil war or corruption or unstable borders, we tend to view it as a failure of their leadership.
We do, yeah.
But the text forces us to realize they were forced into a structural mold that completely fractured their traditional ways of life. We are essentially judging a fish by its ability to climb a tree.
That historical context is vital. So we now have the game board. We have a world carved entirely into sovereign nation-states interacting in a state of anarchy with no world police.
Right. So the obvious next question is, how do we actually analyze what these states are doing?
Exactly. When something massive happens, how do scholars and policymakers filter the noise?
That brings us to our theoretical toolkit. To make sense of the chaos, IR scholars use what they call levels of analysis.
It's basically adjusting the zoom lens on a microscope.
And the text uses the 2008 global financial crisis as the perfect case study to show how this works. Let's walk through that.
Okay, so if you are trying to understand why the 2008 crash happened, and you start at the widest possible view, the system level, you aren't looking at individual people at all.
You are looking at the overarching structure of the global economy.
Right. You see how deeply intertwined global markets have become. You see a massive systemic trend toward financial deregulation across multiple continents.
So from this altitude, the crisis is a story of structural linkages, where a housing bubble bursting in Florida instantly triggers banking collapses in London, Tokyo, and Reykjavik.
Exactly. But if you click the lens down one notch to the state level, the picture completely changes.
Now, you aren't looking at the whole globe. You're looking at specific countries acting as single units.
You're asking, how do the United States' specific regulatory policies fail?
Or, why did the UK government choose to bail out certain banks while the German government took a different approach?
It becomes a story of national, foreign, and domestic policy.
Okay, so zoom in again to the group level, and you basically break the state open.
Now you're looking at the factions operating inside the government and society. The text specifically calls out the misrule of experts.
Oh, right. The incredibly powerful influence of technocrats, central bankers, and massive financial lobbying groups.
At this level, 2008 is a story of regulatory capture. It's about how specific agencies like the SEC or credit rating agencies like Moody's were influenced by corporate groups to label toxic subprime mortgages as safe investments.
And finally, you zoom all the way down to the individual level.
Think about your own mortgage or your own bank account.
At this level, scholars are studying human psychology, right? They are analyzing the specific cognitive biases, the greed, or the fear of individual actors.
Why did the CEO of Lehman Brothers refuse to see the warning signs?
Why did a specific mortgage broker in Nevada push a family into a loan they couldn't afford?
Why did Alan Greenspan, the head of the Federal Reserve, possess an ideology that completely blinded him to the flaws of unchecked capitalism?
It's fascinating because each level provides a completely different explanation for the exact same event.
And none of them are wrong. They're just incomplete without the others, but levels of analysis are just the zoom function.
Right. IR scholars also need grand theories to explain why actors behave the way they do at any of those levels.
And for decades, the field has been dominated by two heavyweight theories: realism and liberalism.
Let's start with realism because it is incredibly bleak.
Here really is.
It's the Darth Vader of IR theories. Realism views human nature as inherently selfish, fearful, and power-hungry.
Thinkers like Hans Morgenthau argued that because we live in an anarchic system, because there is no world police to protect you, every single state must prioritize its own survival above everything else.
And how do you ensure your survival? By maximizing your power.
Realists argue that you can never, ever truly know the intentions of another state. They might be friendly today, but their leadership could change tomorrow.
Therefore, the only logical, rational response to anarchy is to build up your military and economic might.
Morality, ethics, human rights, these are luxurious illusions. In the realist worldview, politics is a zero-sum game.
If your neighbor gets stronger, you automatically become less secure. It's pure paranoia as policy.
It is. Liberalism, on the other hand, is the optimistic counterweight.
And it's important to note, we aren't talking about liberal in the American domestic political sense, like Democrats versus Republicans.
No, we are talking about classical liberal IR theory, which goes back to thinkers like Immanuel Kant.
Liberals look at the exact same anarchic system and draw a totally different conclusion.
They acknowledge that the system is anarchic, but they deeply believe in human progress and rationality.
They argue that states can learn, adapt, and realize that constant warfare is incredibly destructive and expensive.
So how do you solve the anarchy problem? You build institutions and you trade.
The idea is that if country A and country B integrate their economies, if they're constantly buying each other's goods, relying on each other's supply chains, going to war becomes economic suicide.
Plus, liberals argue that shared values, particularly democracy, create peace. Democracies rarely, if ever, go to war with other democracies because leaders are accountable to the public, and the public doesn't want to die in a trench.
So you have realism focusing on military power and survival, and liberalism focusing on economic interdependence and international organizations.
But the text shows how the field has evolved beyond just these two. We now have middle ground theories like constructivism.
Constructivism is fascinating to me. Realists and liberals both treat the world purely in terms of material things, right? Tanks, bombs, money.
Yeah.
But constructivism says, wait a minute, the world's actually made of ideas. It's made of norms and social constructs.
The most famous quote here is from Alexander Wendt. Anarchy is what states make of it.
That quote is so profound. Wendt is saying that the lack of a world police doesn't automatically mean states have to act like rabid dogs. It's not a law of physics.
Right. If states behave aggressively and constantly prepare for war, they construct a reality of enmity. But if they begin to interact cooperatively, build trust, and establish shared norms, they can literally construct a different kind of reality.
It reminds me of the concept of paper money.
Oh, how so?
Well, a $100 bill is physically just a useless piece of cotton and linen. It has zero intrinsic value. But because we all socially agree that it has value, it runs the entire planet.
That's a great comparison.
Constructivists argue that concepts like sovereignty or enemies are just like paper money. They only exist because we collectively agree to act like they exist.
And we can't ignore the critical theories the text introduces, like Marxism and post-structuralism.
Right.
These theories don't just want to explain the world, they want to challenge its core assumptions.
Marxism, for instance, looks at the entire Westphalian state system and says this is a distraction.
Marxists argue the state is merely a tool, a committee managing the affairs of the global ruling class, the bourgeoisie. For them, the real struggle isn't between America and China, it's between the global capitalist class and the global working class.
And post-structuralism goes even further. It completely deconstructs the language of power.
Post-structuralists ask why we even accept the state as the natural unit of human life.
They look at how politicians use language labeling groups as terrorists versus freedom fighters, or calling an intervention a peacekeeping mission versus an invasion to justify violence and maintain control.
These theories are essentially different lenses you can apply to reality.
I always picture them as Instagram filters applied to the exact same photograph.
Okay, I like this.
You take a picture of the world, throw the realism filter on, and it turns up the shadows and the contrast. Everything looks dangerous, stark, and competitive.
Yeah.
Swipe over to the liberalism filter, and it boosts the brightness and warmth. You see the connections, the trade routes, the potential for cooperation.
Right.
Swipe to the Marxist filter, and the borders disappear completely, replacing them with heat maps of wealth and poverty.
The dangerous part about those filters is that leaders forget they are wearing them. Theories aren't just academic thought experiments debated in university halls. They are cognitive maps that dictate life and death decisions.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If a leader goes into power wearing the realist filter, they assume their neighbor is a threat, no matter what.
So to be safe, they build a bunch of tanks and put them on the border.
But their neighbor looks out the window, sees 100 tanks on their border, and says, "Oh my God, they're preparing to invade us." So the neighbor builds 200 tanks.
The first leader sees that and says, "Aha, I knew they were aggressive."
The theory created the exact conflict it predicted through what scholars call the security dilemma.
We saw that security dilemma play out to its absolute terrifying extreme during the Cold War. Which brings us to the next vital piece of the puzzle: diplomacy and international law.
If theory is the blueprint of global politics, diplomacy is the day-to-day maintenance required to keep the house from burning down.
And there is no better example of diplomacy literally saving humanity than the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. It is the ultimate case study.
The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a massive security dilemma. The Soviets secretly transported nuclear ballistic missiles to Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
When U.S. spy planes photographed the launch pads, the world froze.
It was the closest we've ever come to full-scale nuclear annihilation. U.S. President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev were staring into the abyss,
Kennedy's military advisors were pushing for immediate airstrikes and an invasion of Cuba.
which we now know would have almost certainly triggered a Soviet nuclear response.
It was a 13-day standoff.
13 days of just pure terror, honestly.
But what stopped the missiles from flying wasn't one side having a bigger military. It was intense, high-stakes diplomacy. It was structured communication.
Through secret back channels and incredibly tense negotiations, they found a compromise.
Khrushchev agreed to publicly dismantle and remove the missiles from Cuba. In exchange, Kennedy publicly pledged not to invade Cuba.
And crucially, he secretly agreed to remove U.S. Jupiter nuclear missiles from Turkey and Italy, which had been threatening the Soviets.
That compromise-saving face for both sides was the triumph of diplomacy, and it fundamentally altered the architecture of the Cold War.
The sheer terror of those 13 days forced both sides to realize they needed better tools for crisis management.
It directly led to the creation of the Moscow-Washington hotline, ensuring direct communication between leaders, and it paved the way for the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty.
Diplomacy works, but diplomacy often relies heavily on international law. And this is where my brain always stalls out a bit.
Why is that?
Because we already established the international system is anarchic. There is no world police. So if I break a law in my city, the cops show up and arrest me.
Right.
But if a sovereign state breaks international law, who arrests them? Nobody says, how is it actually law?
It relies on consent and the immense power of norms. International law is not a top-down command. It is a horizontal agreement. The text details how a legal norm actually comes into existence through what scholars call the norm life cycle.
Walk me through that.
First, you have norm emergence. This is usually driven by activists, NGOs, or specific states who highlight a horrific issue and propose a new rule.
Okay.
Then you reach a tipping point. This happens when a critical mass of influential states adopts the new rule. Finally, you reach widespread internalization, where the rule becomes so accepted that it just becomes expected behavior.
And breaking it becomes unthinkable.
Exactly.
The global prohibition against torture is a classic example of that, or the responsibility to protect, the R2P doctrine.
The text tells the story of how R2P was born. Back in 1999, NATO intervened in Kosovo to stop ethnic cleansing.
But they did it without the authorization of the UN Security Council, making it technically illegal under international law.
Even though many felt it was morally necessary, this sparked a crisis.
Yes, it highlighted a massive flaw in the system. Does the international community just sit by and watch a genocide happen because the paperwork wasn't approved?
To answer this, a private commission was formed, heavily backed by the Canadian government. They developed the R2P concept.
Which argues that sovereignty isn't just a right to control territory. It implies a responsibility to protect the people living there.
If a state fails that responsibility, the international community has the right to step in.
It was a massive shift in how international law views human life versus state power. But here is the elephant in the room. I think of international law as the house rules in a shared apartment.
Okay, I'm tracking.
There is no landlord. You and your roommates agree to wash your own dishes and keep the noise down after midnight because you have to live together. But what happens when the biggest, richest roommate just decides to blast music at 3 a.m.?
They just ignore the rules.
Right. The text brings up the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. The U.S. wanted UN Security Council authorization, they failed to get it, and they invaded anyway. Doesn't that prove that when push comes to shove, international law is an illusion?
That critique is incredibly common, especially among realists, but it misses the broader, more subtle power of the law.
How so?
Even when the global hegemon breaks the rules, they do not escape the consequences. Following the 2003 invasion, the United States suffered a catastrophic loss of what political scientist Joseph Nye calls soft power.
Soft power being the ability to attract and persuade others rather than forcing them or paying them off.
Exactly. The U.S. didn't get arrested, but their global reputation plummeted. Their ability to build coalitions, to persuade allies to support their initiatives in the future became incredibly difficult.
The blowback was immense because they broke the house rules and suddenly none of the other roommates trust them anymore.
Furthermore, observe how the U.S. invaded. They didn't just say, we're the strongest, we do what we want. They spent months trying to build a legal case.
They presented intelligence to the UN.
They argued that Iraq had violated previous UN resolutions regarding weapons of mass destruction. Even when breaking international law, the most powerful state in the world felt compelled to use the language of international law to try and justify its actions.
Wow, yeah.
The law isn't a police force. It is a language of legitimacy. If you lose your legitimacy, your power becomes incredibly expensive to maintain.
That reframes it completely. The law forces states to explain themselves, and if the explanation is bad, they pay a massive political price.
Precisely.
So far, we've been entirely focused on states, the roommates in the apartment. But if we look at the actual stage of global politics today, it is incredibly crowded. States are no longer the only actors that matter.
No, they aren't. We have to look at the massive network of international organizations and civil society groups.
The modern world is far too complex for states to manage alone, hence the explosion of institutions. But we have to make a very sharp distinction between the two main types. First, we have intergovernmental organizations, or IGOs.
The heavyweight champion being the United Nations.
The UN is the prime example.
Yeah.
But the defining characteristic of an IGO is right in the name, intergovernmental.
It is created by states, funded by states, and ultimately controlled by states. The UN does not have independent sovereignty over its members. It is a forum for interaction.
And it inherently reflects the power dynamics of the states that built it. The text points to the UN Security Council as the ultimate proof of this.
The Security Council has 15 members, but 5 of them, the US, UK, France, Russia, and China, are permanent members.
And they hold the veto.
Yes, the veto is crucial. If 14 countries vote to send peacekeepers to stop a conflict, but Russia or the US raises their hand and says no, the resolution is dead, the UN is paralyzed.
It was a pragmatic compromise made in 1945. The architects of the UN knew that if the major superpowers didn't have a veto, they simply wouldn't join, and the UN would collapse just like the League of Nations did before World War II.
And state sovereignty is guarded so fiercely within the UN that it leads to absurd situations. Look at Taiwan.
By almost any practical metric, Taiwan functions as an independent state. They have a government, an economy, a military, passports.
But they're completely blocked from UN membership or even participation in bodies like the World Health Organization.
Because China claims Taiwan as its own territory and uses its diplomatic leverage to freeze them out. State power dictates the limits of the IGO.
Contrast that structural paralysis with the second category. International non-governmental organizations, or NGOs.
These are formed by private individuals and groups, totally independent of governments, and their ability to reshape the world is astounding. The text highlights the origin of the Red Cross as a prime example.
This is one of the most incredible stories in the book.
It really is. It's 1859. A Swiss businessman named Henry Dunant is traveling in Italy, and he accidentally rides near the aftermath of the Battle of Solferino.
It was a bloodbath between the French-Sardinian alliance and the Austrian army.
Dunant arrives and sees nearly 40,000 dead and wounded soldiers literally just left in the dirt. There is almost no medical corps. Men are dying of easily treatable wounds, crying out for water.
And Dunant didn't just walk away.
He was so horrified that he abandoned his business trip. He rallied the local civilian population, mostly women from nearby villages, and convinced them to treat the wounded from both sides.
Regardless of what uniform they wore.
He goes home and writes a book about it called A Memory of Solferino, which becomes a massive bestseller across Europe.
It sparks a movement that directly leads to the founding of the International Committee of the Red Cross in 1863.
And Dunant's specific proposals in that book led governments to sit down and draft the original Geneva Conventions. One random businessman witnessed a horror, used his voice, and literally wrote the foundation of modern international humanitarian law.
And we see that same mechanism of civil society creating global change today. The text cites the Jubilee 2000 campaign.
A massive transnational network of churches, activists, and rock stars who successfully pressured the world's wealthiest governments and the IMF to cancel over $100 billion in debt for the world's poorest countries.
Or the Ottawa Mine Ban Treaty in 1997, where a coalition of NGOs managed to get anti-personnel landmines banned globally, bypassing the slow, veto-ridden UN process entirely.
So if the UN is like a massive corporate boardroom where 5 founders hold 51% of the voting stock and constantly veto each other, NGOs are like the activist shareholders.
They're the whistleblowers standing in the parking lot with megaphones.
They can't change the corporate bylaws by themselves. They don't have armies or tax revenue, but they have immense moral clarity.
That is the crucial dynamic. NGOs have the agility and the grassroots connection to set the global agenda. They shine a spotlight on the darkness.
But the magic only truly happens when the megaphone interacts with the boardroom.
The defining successes of global governance occur when civil society generates so much public pressure that states and NGOs are forced to enshrine that moral outrage into binding legal treaties.
The text mentions the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio as the perfect example. You had tens of thousands of NGO activists mobilizing the public, putting climate change and biodiversity on the map.
And that pressure forced the state leaders inside the UN summit to actually sign monumental framework agreements.
Yeah, okay, let's bring all of this high-level governance, these treaties and vetoes, back down to earth. Because ultimately, all of this lands on the kitchen table of the everyday citizen.
We have to talk about the global political economy. How does the movement of money across these sovereign borders actually impact human lives?
To frame this, the text relies heavily on the work of the political economist Karl Polanyi. Polanyi revolutionized how we think about markets.
Classical economists tend to treat the market as an abstract mathematical machine totally separate from society. Polanyi argued that this is a dangerous fiction.
Markets are deeply embedded in human communities. Economic life and social life are one and the same.
And he introduced this concept of the double movement. When massive, unregulated free market policies are unleashed, they inevitably cause severe social disruption.
They displace workers, destroy environments, or concentrate wealth at the very top. That's the first movement.
The second movement is society's natural reaction. People push back. They demand labor unions, environmental regulations, tariffs, or welfare protections from the state to shield themselves from the brutal logic of the market.
It is a perpetual tug-of-war between the expansion of the market and the self-protection of society. And in our era of hyperglobalization, that tug-of-war has gone global.
We can see the dark, destructive side of market expansion in modern global supply chains.
The text tells a harrowing, infuriating story about Cambodia in 2006. The Cambodian government granted massive land concessions to private corporations to create sugar plantations.
They literally evicted 1,700 families from their ancestral lands. The military and police came in, bulldozed farms, burned down houses, and shot livestock.
Just like that.
For sugar.
And why did they do this? To produce a cash crop for export. Specifically, they were exploiting a trade initiative created by the European Union called Everything But Arms, which allowed developing nations to export goods to the EU tariff-free. The massive demand for cheap sugar in European supermarkets directly incentivized violent displacement in Southeast Asia.
This is what activists later called blood sugar. But this is where it ties back to civil society. The Cambodian families didn't just give up.
They couldn't rely on their own government for justice because their government was the one bulldozing their homes.
So they used a strategy scholars call boomerang activism.
They realized they lived in a globalized world, so they threw their pleas for help outward into the international arena.
They partnered with global NGOs. They launched the Clean Sugar campaign. They flew to Europe.
They shamed the international banks that were financing the plantations, and they literally filed a lawsuit in London against Tate& Lyle, the massive British sugar company that was buying the product.
They threw the boomerang out, and it looped around to hit the corporations and the Cambodian government from the outside.
It's a brilliant strategy, but it also highlights a terrifying reality of the modern political economy: the immense unchecked power of multinational corporations.
Corporations have become incredibly adept at exploiting the anarchic structure of the Westphalian system. Remember, the system is made of separate sovereign borders.
Corporations operate transnationally across all borders, but they are regulated and taxed locally within specific borders.
They play the Discord servers against each other.
The text highlights how companies engage in tax avoidance. Look at the example provided regarding Netflix. Netflix has millions of paying subscribers in the UK, generating massive revenue.
But they managed to route those European profits through subsidiaries in places like Luxembourg, taking advantage of wildly low tax rates. The text notes they paid essentially a 5% income tax.
This practice, broadly known as base erosion and profit shifting, drains hundreds of billions of dollars from public treasuries globally.
States are so desperate for foreign investment and jobs that they engage in a race to the bottom, slashing corporate taxes and regulations to attract these massive companies. The corporations end up wielding more leverage than sovereign governments.
This brings up a massive contradiction. If you listen to mainstream liberal economists, they will tell you that globalization and free trade are the ultimate engines of human progress.
It's the rising tide that lifts all boats.
But if I look at the news, I see massive populism, anger over corporate tax evasion, and horrific supply chain stories like the Cambodian sugar grabs. If free trade is so great, why is there so much backlash?
That is the defining tension of our era, because both narratives are technically true depending on which level of analysis you use.
Okay.
If you look at the system level, globalization has been an unmitigated triumph. Global GDP has skyrocketed. Hundreds of millions of people in places like China and India have been lifted out of extreme poverty. But if you zoom down to the individual or group level, the picture fractures. The wealth generated by globalization has been captured largely by the very top tier of society.
It has hollowed out the working class in developed nations, shifted immense power to unaccountable corporate boards, and caused environmental devastation.
The populist backlash we see today, the anger, the protests, the demand for closed borders, is Polanyi's double movement. It is society desperately trying to protect itself from the destabilizing force of the global market.
Which perfectly transitions us to the final piece of our decoder ring. We've talked about states, theories, laws, and money. But at the core of all of this are human beings.
Beliefs, identities, and individual safety are woven deeply into international relations.
For a very long time, academic IR scholars operated with a massive blind spot. They completely ignored religion.
The dominant assumption in the 20th century was secularization theory, the belief that as societies modernized, grew wealthier, and adopted science, religion would naturally fade away as a political force.
It was viewed as a relic of the medieval mess.
But then, September 11th, 2001 happened.
The 9/11 attacks were a massive, violent wake-up call to the policy and academic worlds. They realized that not only was religion not fading away, it was actually surging as a transnational political force.
Scholars had to scramble to understand why.
The text explains that religion provides something that standard political ideologies like liberalism or socialism simply can't. It provides sacred symbols.
It offers powerful, deep-seated narratives of absolute good versus absolute evil, of martyrdom, of divine justice, and eternal salvation.
When a political movement attaches its grievances to sacred symbols, it mobilizes people in a way that transcends borders and rational economic calculations.
A standard realist scholar assumes the state will back down from a fight if the cost is too high. But how do you deter an actor who believes that dying in the conflict guarantees them paradise? Traditional deterrence theory completely breaks down.
This realization forced a broader shift in how we think about security itself. The text details the transition from state security to human security.
In the traditional Westphalian mindset, the only thing that matters is protecting the state's borders from an invading army. If the border is secure, the state is secure.
But that definition ignores a horrific, undeniable statistic. In the 20th century, far more people were murdered by their own governments than were killed by foreign enemies in wars.
Scholars call this democide. Stalin's purges, Mao's Great Leap Forward, the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide. The sovereign state, the entity supposedly designed to protect its people, was historically the greatest threat to their lives.
I always use the analogy of a nightclub bouncer. The traditional concept of sovereignty means the state is the bouncer. Their job is to stand at the door and protect the patrons inside from the dangerous elements out on the street.
But human security asks, what happens when the bouncer locks the doors, pulls out a weapon, and starts attacking the patrons?
Oh, that's a terrifying thought.
And that question leads to the most agonizing moral dilemma in international relations. If the state is massacring its own people, does the international community, the police outside the club, have a moral obligation to kick the door down, breach the club's sovereignty, and save the patrons?
This is the responsibility to protect, R2P coming back around. But it's incredibly divisive.
Very.
If you allow states to breach sovereignty for humanitarian reasons, don't you just create a massive loophole for powerful empires to invade weaker countries whenever they want?
Exactly. Scholars are violently divided on this. The optimistic or liberal interventionist camp argues that human rights must trump state sovereignty, but we must use strict multilateral UN mechanisms to ensure the intervention is genuine and not just a land grab.
And the other side.
The tragic or realist camp argues that powerful states are entirely self-interested. They will weaponize the language of human rights. They will claim they are intervening to save people, when in reality they are just toppling a regime they dislike or securing access to oil.
They argue that opening the door to humanitarian intervention destroys the Westphalian rule of non-interference, which will ultimately lead to endless, chaotic wars that kill even more people.
And compounding all of this human complexity is technology. The text points out that the digital age is the ultimate double-edged sword.
On one hand, the internet bypasses borders completely. It connects humanity.
Yeah.
It allows a young activist in Cairo during the Arab Spring to use Twitter to organize a massive democratic protest that topples a dictator. It empowers the individual.
But the state pushes back. The Great Firewall of China is the textbook example of a state asserting its sovereignty over the digital realm. The state uses the exact same technology, the internet, AI, facial recognition to filter information, silence dissent, and build a surveillance apparatus that absolute monarchs in the 1600s couldn't even dream of.
Technology empowers the citizen, but it supercharges the state. Okay, take a deep breath. We have journeyed through centuries of history and complex theory today. Let's look at the decoder ring we've built.
We started with the sheer trauma of the 30 Years' War, which birthed the Westphalian sovereign state, the ultimate group chat where everyone gets their own private server.
We watched the French Revolution infuse those states with the fiery passion of the nation, creating the nation-state model that Europe violently exported to the rest of the globe.
We learned to adjust our lenses, using levels of analysis to see how the 2008 financial crisis looks totally different depending on whether you focus on global systems or individual grade.
We explored how realists see a world of paranoid survival, while liberals see the potential for trade and peace, and constructivists remind us that the rules are only what we make them.
We stood in the room during the Cuban Missile Crisis and saw how diplomacy pulled humanity back from the nuclear brink.
We learned that international law isn't a police force, but a set of house rules that punishes rule breakers by destroying their soft power and legitimacy.
We navigated the crowded 21st century stage, balancing the structural gridlock of the UN Security Council against the moral megaphone of NGOs like the Red Cross.
We saw the human cost of globalized markets, from Cambodian land grabs to corporate tax havens. And finally, we confronted the undeniable power of religion, the moral agony of human security, and the digital battleground.
Which leaves us with one final provocative thought to mull over, drawn right from the conclusion of our source text.
We've spent this entire deep dive establishing that the Westphalian state, that private Discord server with hard borders, is the undisputed fundamental building block of our world. But look out your window today.
We have cyber warfare, where malicious code travels from Moscow to Washington in milliseconds, completely ignoring borders.
We have a rapidly warming climate that doesn't care about customs checkpoints or passports.
We have massive multinational corporations with economies larger than entire continents and digital currencies designed specifically to bypass national central banks.
The Westphalian state was invented to solve the specific territorial problems of 17th century Europe. The burning question is that 400-year-old technology finally becoming obsolete in the face of 21st century borderless crises.
Are we currently living through the painful, messy death of the nation state? And if the state is dying, what on earth comes next?
That is something for you to think about the next time you scroll through your news feed. The world stage is complex, but it was built by people. And what was built by people can't be changed by people. Keep questioning the map because the lines are definitely blurring. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.